Well, thank you for coming to the second half of the Beyond Susan B. presentation. This presentation is made possible by a generous grant from the Woodlands at the Fairport Baptist Home, and we thank them very much for their support in this effort. My name is Jack Kowiak, and last week we spoke about two other very important women in the struggle for women's rights, three women. We spoke about Mary Wollstonecraft and the famous Grimke sisters. Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the famous Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the first seminal works in feminism and women's rights, and the Grimke sisters, which gave all you gals out there the right to speak in public and broke that glass ceiling. But today, we're going to speak about Victoria Woodhull, who is also known as Mrs. Satan. And she's also known as the notorious Victoria. And she's also known as the terrible siren. Well, what in the world did this woman do to garner these types of nicknames? Well, her story starts out in the Midwest, or close to the Midwest at least, over in Homer, Ohio, back in 1838. And she had some pretty bizarre parents. Her mother was Annie Claflin, and she was quite strange. She would go into these religious trances, and she would be very much into spiritualism. Many of her friends and neighbors considered to be kind of borderline mentally stable. Her father was Reuben Buck Claflin. And in my research, the nicest thing I could find that was written about him said that he looked like a sneak and a skinflint. Any kind of nefarious thing, whether it was cheating somebody at horse trading or stealing anything that wasn't nailed down, somehow he was always involved in it. It was said that the only real skill that he had in life was the ability to sire beautiful daughters. And Victoria was one of these daughters. She was daughter number 3 and was born in 1838. She was named after Queen Victoria, which was kind of a fad back then. So good old Buck thought to himself, well, the way I should make a living is really marry off my daughters to some wealthy men, and I will live off of them. And that was his grand scheme. So poor Victoria, he decided to marry her off at the tender age of 15 to what he lined up to be this quote unquote wealthy doctor, a fellow by the name of Dr. Canning Woodhull. Actually, he had a relation to a supervisor, a past councilman of the town of Webster, way back then in the early 18th century. But at the tender age of 15, good old Buck marries Victoria off to this doctor. Well, it turns out back in those days, Ohio did not have strict licensing for doctor. So he really never went to school for being a doctor. He had some kind of a mail order degree. And on top of that, this guy was a drunk, he was a womanizer, and he was a morphine addict. And Victoria wound up being pregnant very quickly after the marriage. And he went off on a morphine binge with her ready to give birth. And he left her in this flea bag motel, no midwife, nothing. She had to give birth to the child by herself. She became very ill. The child became very, very ill. He was gone on some morphine binge. So she had to contact her mother and her sister to come and help her. And when they came to help her, they found her in a hotel room that was unheated, and there were literally icicles hanging from the bedpost. That's how cold it was. Victoria was quite ill, and so was the child. And unfortunately, the child wound up being mentally challenged. And Victoria always blamed the horrible prenatal and afterbirth care that she had for the condition of her child. She stated that the child was fathered by a drunk and born in squalor. Well, she was able to get a divorce from this gentleman, but it was very difficult in those days to do it. She finally was able to do it, and she had to support her child. So she decided to move over to San Francisco with her child to try to find some kind of work. So when she got over there, this person saw her and said, you know, you're kind of a nice looking gal. Why don't you stand out in front and be a cigar store girl? And this was kind of person that was out there in front to attract customers to sell cigars. So she did that during the day, and at nighttime, to earn extra money, by candlelight, she worked as a seamstress. And she was sewing theater costumes for a job that she had. And the theater manager came to pick up these costumes and said to her, hey, you know, you're a nice looking gal and you've got a really nice voice. Did you ever consider going on stage? Now, in those days, being a stage actress was not considered to be a reputable type of occupation or pastime for a woman. But Victoria needed the money. And so she went on stage there in the San Francisco area, and she became quite a successful stage actress. She was one of the most prominent actresses in the area. And she started to make a good living. She was making what would be equivalent today to maybe about upwards of about $75,000 up to $100,000 a year. Now she was able to afford a home and also able to care for her child. And she was doing quite well, and it was quite happy. But then one day she got a knock on the door. And she goes over, and who's at the door? Well, it was good old Buck. Buck heard that she had money. Buck heard that she was doing well. So he not only came over there to try to live off Victoria's money, he brought the whole family with him. And they were all going to live off of Victoria there since she's doing so well as this actress over there in San Francisco. Well, needless to be said, Victoria wasn't too crazy about this idea. So Buck kind of changed gears and said, well, I'll tell you what, Victoria, I actually got this plan to open this patent medicine show. That's what I want to get into. I got a secret formula I came up with. So if you give me some money to start this show, I'll go and get out of your hair. So Victoria gives him some money to start the show, and Buck felt that it wasn't quite enough money that he needed, so he wound up stealing a bunch of money from the box office of the theater that Victoria worked in. And he goes on the road with this patent medicine show. Now, Buck was not up front as the huckster for this concoction that he came up with. Instead, he got another one of the beautiful daughters by the name of Tennessee. They called her Tenny. And she was the one toting this concoction. It was called Miss Tennessee's Magneto Life Elixir. And Tenny was not a great speaker to be out there in front of the crowds, but she did attract large crowds of men. And one of the papers reported that, you know, even though she wasn't a speaker, she tended to get large crowds of men because she displayed a wondrous shirt front. So they're going along, but then they had a problem because someone made the mistake of actually drinking a bottle of this stuff. And they just about dropped dead. And so the authorities went after them. So they had to flee from where they were in Minnesota. And what do? They run back to Victoria to bail them out. Well, they get back to San Francisco, but it turns out that Victoria lost her job as an actress because the stage company found out that it was her father that stole the money from the box office. And she was out of work, but the family needed help. They're coming to her. So Victoria, being ever resourceful, says, well, why don't we do something, because the mother was into spiritualism, why don't we do something in terms of seances? That's a big trend now, to do these kind of seances. And we'll set up this thing called the Magnetic Healing Institute, the Conservatory of Metaphysical, Mental, and Spiritual Science. So both Victoria and Tenny got into the spiritualism business, and they started running different seances and such in the San Francisco area. Now, there was only so much business for this type of thing in San Francisco at the time, so they decided if they really want to make some money out of this, they have to move to better grounds. You know, they could get some more funds from this. So they decided, where do people have some more money, a bigger place? Well, how about the Big Apple? New York City. And they thought to themselves, well, where in New York City where are there people who just have a real lot of money to give to us, and they're really destined and they're really keen on trying to understand the future? And then it occurred to them, that would be Wall Street. Yeah, all these brokers and stockbrokers and stuff like that, they got money coming out of their pockets and they really want to understand the future. So they went into business being the spiritualists and seance people for all of the Wall Street brokers. And there was a very famous scion of business who was very much into spiritualism, and one of the very first clients that the Victoria and Tennessee had, and that was Cornelius Vanderbilt, a huge railroad tycoon. And he was just enchanted with those two sisters, with Victoria and Tennessee. And he used to regale them with all these talks about Wall Street, and he went on about how these brokers were actually clueless, and they really knew just about nothing in terms of what they were doing there in business. So Victoria asked him one day, well, you know, if these brokers really aren't that well trained and don't know that much, why can't Tennessee and I go into business? And Cornelius said, be the first female brokerage on Wall Street? He says, there are no female brokers. But he says, well, you know something? You know probably just as much as anybody else. Just to prove what a bunch of fools they are, I'm going to give you some money to invest, and I'm going to give you some stock tips to get started. So by this time, Victoria had remarried a Colonel James Harvey Blood. And the idea was they were going to put him behind the scenes to run the books and the numbers, and Victoria and Tennessee would be the salespeople for this brokerage firm. So they go into business with some tips and some initial starting money from Cornelius, but it turned out to be a very difficult thing to attract new clients. Nobody wanted to go to female brokers. So Victoria was thinking to herself, well, maybe we can get some female clients to come to us. So she said, where in New York do we have some females that have a great deal of cash they're sitting on that they're probably not investing? I got it, she says. There's all of these madams and these bordellos that exist uptown. They're probably sitting on a lot of cash to invest. They're probably not doing anything with it. So she goes to them and makes the pitch to, don't just sit on your money in a mattress, give it to me and I'll invest it. And Victoria said, by the way, you know, in these bordellos, you have a lot of these stockbrokers that are coming in as clients. Why don't you have your gals ply these stockholders for tips when they come in for services, and you feed those stock tips back to me? So then she set up this system where she had all of these clients and money coming in from these madams, and then all of these stock tips flowing in through the prostitutes who were relaying them to the client stockholders, and her brokerage firm started to get off the bat and doing well. And then she started playing it up and buying some very expensive furnishings, perhaps she couldn't afford, to kind of fake it some more, to look like she was really, really doing well. And then they really made their mark. And they picked up their nickname from the press, the Bewitching Brokers, because Cornelius Vanderbilt gave them this tip that there was going to be a run on the market. And he said, this is how I think this is going to play out. So when this was going to happen, Victoria came with her sister in a carriage. They weren't allowed onto the stock exchange floor, so they were in a carriage on the street, and they were sending in these runners. And when the run on the market happened, they knew just what to do, and they cornered the market in a magnificent way. And just in the matter of an afternoon, they made a ton of money. They made, in those days, dollars, it was about $320,000, but in today's dollars, it'd be equivalent to about $15 million they made. And all of a sudden, they were famous. Here's a cartoon that ran in the New York Daily Telegraph. They dubbed them the Queens of Finance, and it shows them whipping the bulls and bears of Wall Street, and then throwing his chicken feed to the other stockbrokers and running everybody else under the wheels of their magnificent financial machine. So they became very famous now and had a long list of male and female clients coming to their door. And they were very good at getting publicity. They knew how to play to the press to get even more publicity. For example, both Victoria and Tennessee would cut their hair short like men and tend to dress in men's-like clothes, so they would look like kind of male stockbrokers. So Victoria had this successful brokerage firm going, and she was doing a lot of stuff with the press, and she was always interested in the newspaper industry and getting her views out. And she decided, well, why don't I take some of my money and I could become something that's also never done before, the first woman publisher. I mean, with the first woman stockbroker, why not be the first woman publisher? And she took her money to start a paper, the Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly. And she wanted the thrust of this paper to be focusing in on reform movements. So she hired as her main editor this fellow that was kind of way out there in terms of being a reformist. His name was Stephen Pearl Andrews. And one of the first things that they ran in their paper was the first translation in America of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Now, Victoria was also making her own editorial contributions. And she would dictate things that were written by others, formalized off by others, having to do with protest against child labor, workers' rights, and very much she was into women's rights and women's suffrage at the time. And one of the things that caught her eye in the news that she spoke about a lot in her paper was something that was called the New Departure Strategy that came about in 1870. At this time, in women's suffrage, Susan B. Anthony was over in Washington, and she was trying to get her newspaper, The Revolution, off the ground. And she had this proposal for a 16th Amendment to the Constitution that would give women the right to vote. But it was going no place. It was just stuck in Congressional committee, and she couldn't get the time of day of any type of congressman to come in and see them to listen to her pleas or listen to her arguments to move this forward. But another woman popped up by the name of Virginia Minor. And she says, Susan B. Anthony is wasting her time with this 16th Amendment because she says it's unnecessary because we already have the right to vote. And her argument was this New Departure Strategy. And she said, well, if you look at the two amendments we already have, the 14th Amendment, it says that all persons born in the US are citizens. Well, women are born in the United States. And the 15th Amendment said, you cannot deny the vote to citizens based upon race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Well, we've certainly been under conditions of servitude if you look at how we've been treated in society. So under these two amendments, we already have the right to vote. And Victoria made this a main theme of her writings and her newspaper and wrote many editorials about this. And she backed it up with action. She stormed the polls in 1871 with a group of women to cast her ballots in the general election. This was in 1871. Now, last week we spoke about this. When was it that Susan B. Anthony did this thing where she kind of forced her way to try to vote? Wasn't until 1872. Yeah, Susan B. Anthony wasn't the first. Victoria came before her, and so did the Grimke sisters that we spoke about last week. Well, in the meantime, there was a very famous Civil War general by the name of Benjamin Butler, who became a very famous person in Congress. He became the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. And he became good friends with Tennessee. And he thought Tennessee was just charming. And Tennessee laid out these arguments to him that her sister Victoria was working on about the fact that women already had the right to vote. And Benjamin said, well, why don't you and your sister come and present your ideas to our Judiciary Committee? Well, that was unheard of, but it happened. Victoria came with a group of women and became the very first woman in the United States to address a congressional body. She addressed the Congressional Committee of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee in 1871 and laid out the arguments on why women had the right to vote under the previous 14th and 15th Amendments. Quite an achievement. And there were many women's rights leaders across the country that were applauding what Victoria was able to accomplish. All except one, because one of them was kind of steaming mad about this. Oh, Susan B. Anthony, she couldn't get the time of day with any of these congressional leaders. And these people were not only usurping her in terms of going to Congress, but they were arguing against her big platform of the 16th Amendment and having that on the docket. But she never said that in public because her paper, The Revolution, was going under and she needed financial support, and she knew Victoria had money and could help support her with this paper. So what she would say in public was that she was impressed by Victoria's money, brains, and unceasing energy. Well, now that Victoria had the successful stockbroker, first woman publisher, first woman to address Congress, she started to get more interested in politics, especially with her forays in speaking to Congress. And she made the bold move and decided that she would run for president in the next coming election in 1872 election, actually. And she declared presidency. She said, "I now announce myself as a candidate for the presidency. I anticipate criticism, but however unfavorable, I trust that my sincerity will not be called into question." And she mounted a presidential campaign. Now, she was criticized. And remember last week, I was speaking about Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and how she kind of laid into with severe criticism the Grimke sisters because they were speaking in public. And Harriet Beecher Stowe said that was a disgrace to the abolitionist movement. Well, she laid into Victoria as well for running for president. And this is what Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about Victoria's presidential bid. She said that no woman that was not willing to be dragged through every kennel and slopped into every dirty pail of water like an old mop would ever consent to run as a candidate. Why, it's an ordeal that kills a man. And what sort of brazen tramp of a woman would it be that could stand it and come out of it without being killed? Would it be any kind of woman that we would want to see at the head of our government? Well, this didn't dissuade Victoria. She called her party that she ran the Equal Rights Party. And she had Frederick Douglass be the running mate as her vice presidential running mate. History is unclear on whether he ever accepted this nomination or not. But her platform was very much around women's rights in a series of social reforms, like the 8-hour workday, a nationalization of railroads, abolishing the death penalty, child labor laws, workers' rights, many type of social reforms that later came to be. And the other key part of her platform was free love. Free love? Well, it wasn't quite as salacious as it looks on the surface. What she meant by this was the problems with 19th century marriage. And last week I spoke about how legally disadvantaged women were in marriages at that time, that they had no rights if the husband died to the property or even to the children, and how difficult it was to get a divorce at that time. Plus, they were a prisoner of economics. Women were not trained and educated such that if they left the marriage, it was very difficult for them to make a living without the financial support of their husband. And also this hypocrisy that there was in marriages, that the men could go off to prostitutes and have mistresses and everybody cast a blind eye, but if the wife even looked at another man, she was scorned as someone who was a horrible woman. And all of this stuff had horrible effects and harms the children. And she pointed to her own child that was mentally challenged because of all the abuse that she had from her first husband. So what she said is she would have these talks, Trial as by Fire or The True and False Socially, a presentation of Victoria Woodhull. She would say that once they got into the talks, women cannot bear their best children except by the men that they love best and whom they have the keenest desire. If they no longer love their men, they should be able to get a divorce and remarry. Now, she wasn't akin to playing up the salacious end of this to get people in the hall. But once they were in the hall, this is what her platform was about, the inequality of marriage and how it handcuffed women. Well, at this time, during her presidential campaign, there was a very famous preacher. Actually, it was Harriet Beecher Stowe's uncle, a fellow by the name of Henry Ward Beecher. And he worked out of the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, and he was kind of the Oral Roberts, Jimmy Swaggart of his day. He crammed in huge amounts of people into his preaching and into his church. And it came to Victoria's attention, and she was approached by a friend of hers by the name of Theodore Tilden, who said that this preacher was a big phony, that he's trying to seduce his wife. And he's just outraged about the fact that this phony preacher was a hypocrite and trying to seduce his wife. So Victoria supported him and started writing articles in the paper revealing this adultery, making accusations against Beecher, and this culminated in an adultery trial, with Tilden going after Beecher. And it was very, very famous. It was kind of like the OJ trial of the 19th century. And this picture is a picture of a cartoon in a paper, and it's showing different episodes of the trial with the woman sitting on his lap and them, these various exploits that they were supposed to be doing. Well, the trial ended such that Beecher was not convicted of adultery. And Beecher was furious at Victoria Woodhull for running these articles in the paper, revealing this, his activities. So he talked to the DA, and he had Victoria prosecuted under this kind of a roundabout way of applying a law called the Comstock Law. What he said was that, the DA said, charged Victoria with was, well, Victoria was writing these salacious details about this affair that Beecher was having with this woman. But there was a court case that said that adultery affair did not happen legally. So what she was printing was fiction, which made it pornography. So she was arrested under the Comstock Law for sending obscene materials through the mail. And there's this giant trial and problems for Victoria. Well, in the meantime, his wife, who was the one that Beecher was trying to seduce, kind of made a statement, and then she wound up recanting it because Beecher's lawyers intimidated her away from testifying. So she wanted the truth to surface because she saw these issues that was happening for Victoria and other people, that they were getting called into court. So she wanted to approach someone who was notable that would get the word out that, you know, this was true about the adultery. No matter what happened in court, how the court thing came out, it was true. It wasn't a false thing that Victoria was printing. So Elizabeth went to Susan B. Anthony and told her this whole thing and laid out the affair was true and la, 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 la. And Susan took all these notes and said, thank you very much. And then escorted Elizabeth to the door. And then when Elizabeth left, Susan B. Anthony took all her notes and crumpled them all up and just threw them away and let Victoria twist and win. So eventually, Victoria was able to settle all of the legal affairs so that she was not thrown in jail, but it took the better part of a year. And it just crashed everything that she had. It took up just about all of her money to defend herself in court. And it sent the presidential campaign to the drink. And actually, it turned out that she couldn't have been president anyhow, because she was a few months short of being 35 years old in March of 1873 when she would have been inaugurated. So technically, she couldn't have been president. That's why some people, when they say who was the first president, woman to run for president, they'll mention Delvaux Lockwood instead. And they kind of disqualify Victoria because of that technicality. But her brokerage firm went bankrupt as a result. newspaper folded, even her marriage folded. And she was left penniless without much prospects. But Victoria, being the ever resourceful person, regrouped herself and decided that she would go over to England, across the pond, and try to start anew. And she took up the seance business again with her sister, Tennessee. And they decided to target and be the seance people for London's upper class. And in doing so, they were able to make phenomenal connections. As a matter of fact, Tennessee wound up marrying and became Lady Cook, the Viscountess of Montserrat. And Victoria wound up marrying, and in 1882, she married John Woodhull Martin, the wealthiest banker in all of England, one of the wealthiest people in all of England. And John Woodhull wound up dropping dead a year after he married Victoria. And at that time in England, they had reformed the laws, and Victoria was able to inherit all of his money and became one of the richest women in all of England. And she was very much involved in social reforms like she was in the United States, setting up trade schools to train women in various types of careers that weren't open to them before, doing agricultural experiments. During World War I, she was very much involved with relief efforts for the soldiers. And she was into technology. She was one of the first women in England to own an automobile. And here's her at the age of 87, racing around in her estates. That's one of her daughters she had in the second marriage, Zulu, who's imploring her mother to slow down, slow down. She's racing through. And this was actually the son that was mentally challenged that she had under the first husband. She wound up passing away at the age of 89 over there in England. Now, when you read about Victoria, it's very difficult to separate fact from fantasy because she had so many enemies. There were so many people making false accusations against her. For example, they said, well, you know, when she went to San Francisco, she wasn't a cigar store girl, she was actually a prostitute, right? And then she was heavily criticized because after she was successful as a stockbroker, she saw to it that her first husband, who was on Skid Row as this morphine addict, was taken in and taken care of. And they made all kinds of salacious accusations about her going back to her first husband when she was married to the second, and all these other things about free love and all of that. And again, being an actress and good at publicity, Victoria knew how to play up certain things to bring in an audience and to bring up a crowd. But whatever you say about her, her accomplishments are undeniable. She was the first woman to run for president. She was the first woman not only to be a Wall Street stockbroker, to be a very successful Wall Street stockbroker. She was the first woman to address Congress. She was also the first woman to be a successful publisher. And also, she was the first person, actually, to openly discuss issues having to do with marriage and sexuality at that time. She single-handedly took a jackhammer to the glass ceiling with all she accomplished. Yet, she's rarely mentioned because people will often bring up, well, given all this stuff that she was involved with, what kind of role model was she? You know, getting stock tips from prostitutes and all of this other thing. Well, you know, that's a funny thing. When they had a celebration of Susan B. Anthony, they brought in a professor, I think she was from University of Wisconsin, Professor Ann Dexter Gordon. And in her talk, when she was here in Rochester, she said, to find inspiration in an historical figure is a complex task. We create a phantom person for our modern purposes out of odd bits of her life that we value. In other words, we put someone up on a pedestal. And to some extent, that's kind of how we are in America to a large extent. When we look at our heroes and we look at our villains, we want our heroes to be 100% good, and we want our bad guys to be 100% bad. And we don't deal very well with this gray in the middle. And the ladies I spoke about in my talks the last two times, you know, they had some gray. Victoria had a lot of personal issues where there was gray there. And the Grimke sisters were former slave owners, and Victoria had a lot of shenanigans as well. But you know something? There is no perfect women's rights heroine. I mean, Susan B. Anthony was less than perfect. And when we look at this, putting people up on a pedestal, I mean, we have a lot of heroes that we look to that are men historical figures, but we don't put him on pedestals as much as we recognize them for their achievements. I mean, Benjamin Franklin had a string of all these different mistresses. And Alexander Hamilton, he made his fortune and all of his money in a slave trading firm. They don't mention that in the musical, right? They don't have a song about that in the musical. But we look past that to recognize their achievements. And that's, we should treat women the same way and do the same thing. That they should be recognized for their contribution in advancing women's rights. And the 4 women that I spoke about these past couple of weeks, you'd be hard pressed to find any other women in their times or any other times that contributed more to women's rights than these gals. Well, I want to thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, please send them in on the chat. And if you would like to ask a question, you're going to have to go to the lower left-hand corner of your screen and click on that microphone button and make sure it's green before you speak. So let me turn it back now to Stacy and see if we have any questions from either this presentation or the one that I gave last week.
Oh, I had a question.
Go ahead.
When we were talking about the Grimke sisters, and you were talking about the home in Charleston, I was just there a couple of months ago and saw maybe one of the homes, but I think you mentioned that the home that is there now is a bed and breakfast or something like that, but it didn't look like the home and the historical markers that we saw. It was a business like a legal office or something like that, and it supposedly was the home that they lived in Charleston, the Grimke family. And I'm just wondering if there were a couple of homes.
Yeah, it's possible that the photo that I showed on that could have been maybe 20 years old. And since then, the business, it got revised or repainted and, you know, somebody else moved into the place. So it's possible I had a dated photo on.
But it was very interesting to visit that spot and to read the historical markers. And also, I wondered if you knew the book that was more of a novel, but a historical novel, The Invention of Wings.
Yes.
Yes. How true some of that might be to the family.
Not very true. See, it was one of those things based on historical, you know, story. So she took the general outlines of the idea of someone from the South being these speakers, and then after that, there wasn't a lot of factual stuff.
Yeah, like about how she had to follow her father and take care of him because he went north and he was dying.
Yes.
But I think you had a different explanation for how she went north.
Yeah, actually, the father did be ill, and Sarah did have to take care of him. But it didn't happen the way they kind of laid it out in that particular book. But yeah, there were things there that were true that she took from the book, but there are also a lot of things in there that weren't. There's not a lot written about the Grimke sisters. And actually, we don't even have any type of paintings or illustrations of them when they were young. There's only one set of illustrations we have of them, and when they were quite old already, that someone did drawings of them. It's unfortunate there isn't more written about them.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Any other questions? I don't have anything in the chat.
As I mentioned, this presentation will be available on YouTube, along with the previous presentation I gave last week about Mary Wollstonecraft and the Grimke sisters. So if you know anybody that might be interested in that, please forward the links to them, and they could watch both talks and get educated on some forgotten people in women's rights that I think everyone should know about. And to be honest, my personal opinion, they're a heck of a lot more interesting to learn about than the big three. Everybody take care.
Bye. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.